Hi, this is Mark Lewisohn. You're listening to Fab4Cast with me and with Vibo, Michiel and Jan Kees.
Ladies and gentlemen,
the Fab Four.
Fab Four.
John, Paul,
The Fab Four.
George, Ringo.
Fab Four. Fab Four.
We have for you the Fab Four.
The Fab Four.
Fab4Cast.
Hi, Fab4Casters, and welcome to part 2 of our interview with the great Mark Lewisohn. In the previous episode, we talked about Mark's writing and research of the Beatles' history. And in this episode, we focus on the Beatles' activities in the spring of 1969. The fascinating period between the end of the Get Back sessions, that's February 1st, and the official start of the Abbey Road sessions on July the 1st. A lot happened during this period, as you will hear. Okay, over to you, Mark.
We could begin talking at any point, but I will just say that I started this year, again, more for Volume 3 than Volume 2, but it's all part of the mix. I spent the whole of January 2019 listening to the Beatles in January 1969 on each day, the 50th anniversary, listening to all the Nagra tapes that leaked out about 20 years ago, you know, those masses of bootlegs that everybody's got.
I never listened to.
Well, that's it.
Including you, yeah. But now you listen to them.
That's it. They had been on my... Somebody at a Beatles convention in Liverpool said, here's a set of 150 CDs. 150 CDs. I think that was only the A reels. It wasn't even the A's and B's. It's like 150 CDs, and this is all of January 1969. And I took them home and I put them on my shelf, and I went, what am I going to do with those? Yeah. But for this anniversary month of January, I got it all not condensed. I got it all ordered. Got the A's and B's. So I had a complete set of all available audio, all properly integrated, A's and B's, and even I think a C at the end, all integrated so that I didn't miss a thing, but I didn't have duplication either. And it was 97.5 hours of audio. And I just did it on January the 2nd. When they started, I started, and so on and so on. And it got really tough near the end because I was also transcribing.
Oh, yeah.
Not everything, but certainly the stuff that needed to be transcribed. I was improving a transcript that already existed, but it needed a lot of work. And I was making notes and following up leads of things that were being suggested. This is a long answer. I only do long answers. It was a revelatory process for me, and I realised that I have always misunderstood that whole month. And it's been got right best by Doug Sulpy in his book, but still I would say it could be more right. But that's by far the best Drugs, Divorce and a Slipping Image at the moment. But I'm going to write it differently with... different insight.
What's your feeling about that month?
What's my feeling? My feeling is that, it's a very complex. It was a complex month, but there's a lot of clarity within it. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but it was full of surprises. First of all, if John Lennon and George Harrison were the two Beatles who were the most keen to make us think that it was the most, John said, the most miserable sessions on earth. And George also said very similar words. And George Martin talked about endless arguments that they were having, constant arguments. There aren't any. There aren't any arguments at all. What you hear is a cohesive, clear-minded, purposeful group. They're not quite sure what it is what the end product of the thing they've started is going to be. They start rehearsing without knowing how it's going to finish. They can't make a decision on this TV show. It's going to be a TV show, but where are they going to shoot it, and what kind of audience will it have, or will it have an audience, and will it be in another country or will it be in England? Those are decisions that they continually discuss during the course of the month and in the end never resolve. It ends without a resolution other than the fact that they go up on the roof. But if I was to ask you guys, and you guys all know your Beatles very well, and I could ask the listening people as well, the audience, if I was to say to you, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, tell me for each one of those who wanted to go up on the roof and who didn't, what would you say?
I would say Paul wanted to go up and George didn't. John
well, eventually he thought, yeah, let's do it. And Ringo is Ringo. I think he got along with the rest of them.
I think John, in connection with Michael Lindsay Hogg, the two of them, decided to go up on the roof.
Right. All four keen to do it?
Yes.
I mean, I don't let me.
Well,
I didn't mean to turn this into an interrogation, but it's interesting.
It's the same thing as we both think.
I think I would have said Paul wanted to do it.
Yeah.
John maybe, George no, and Ringo perhaps. Similar to what you said. Well, there's a clear discussion on the day before they do it. John and Ringo want to do it. George is, I don't really want to do it, but if it'll help finish this thing, I'll go and do it. So George is that. Paul doesn't want to do it.
Really?
Yes. Paul does. The one who doesn't want to go up there is Paul.
The day before?
The day before. And there's a bit of that in the anthology film when they're talking to... There's a nice bit of film in the anthology in which you see them discussing it. But the implication is that Paul is actually pushing the idea, but in fact he was the one who didn't want to do it. Not because he didn't want to do something with the Beatles. On the contrary, he was very keen. He had lots of ideas of things they should do, or could do. But he didn't want to go up on the roof. He didn't want the roof to be the climax of all the work they've been doing for the month, because that isn't enough of a climax. So it wasn't that he was against the idea of doing it, but in terms of the roof, he was the one who had to be persuaded, and he was the one who was not giving his decision until the morning of the event. Yeah. So
what he wanted to do a more fancy place, right?
Yeah,
like
in the desert or on a boat.
Yeah, no, the desert was never really an option.
Okay, okay, the boat maybe.
Ringo and Maureen talked about this probably between Christmas and New Year. He's got a family man now. He's got 2 young children at home. And he likes being around the house, and he likes being with Maureen and with the kids, and he likes to work. But he's going to be making a film in February, The Magic Christian, which he's making throughout the period we will be talking about. So he doesn't want to go abroad in January to do a concert. It's just like he doesn't want to fit it into his life. It's not suitable for him. So when they begin at Twickenham, he's already made it clear that he won't go abroad, won't go to do this in another country. And the thing about Ringo, and you hear this clearly if you listen to all the tapes for January, is that he doesn't say very much, but when he says something, it carries weight. And if Ringo's not going abroad, it's not happening abroad. It's as simple as that. It's not happening because he's not going, because he doesn't change his mind. You know, you might try and have a go at changing his mind, but usually he's made his mind up, and that's it. So though Dennis O'Dell, the film producer, was suggesting an amphitheatre in Tripoli, it was never really on the agenda. There was a brilliant discussion one night, I don't know, what is it, around the 7th or the 8th. The Nagra tapes of 69, they enable you to hear Beatle meetings. How many Beatle meetings do we have recordings of, where they're sitting around chucking in their thoughts and opinions, and you really get to hear the complexity of their interplay. And there's 2 or 3 of those on the Nagra tapes, and there's this one where they're thinking if they did go to Tripoli, they could go on a boat. Maybe QE2 or Cunard would provide a liner because of the publicity or whatever, and they wouldn't have to pay for it. Not that that was really their concern, but it was being suggested. And then Paul is saying, well, we could take the audience with us on the boat. And George is going, hang on a minute. When I leave here every day, I can go back home and shut my front door. I don't want to be on a boat with fans for 2 weeks, rehearsing, and I can't get away. I've got no space, no privacy. So the opportunity to hear conversations like that is just so revealing. So it was a brilliant month for me, January 2019. It was exhausting, but brilliant. And it changed my head on the way that they weren't arguing at all. George Martin also says they were doing, they didn't want to do overdubs, so they would do endless takes of things. So there's this take, and by the time you get to, John would say, how was that, George? And I would say, well, I think take 69 was a bit better, but maybe take 47 had a different solo. I don't know why George Martin felt the need to say that, because when you hear the tapes, they're not like that at all. They're not doing multiple takes of things. They are playing to get inside the songs because their intention is to perform them just as a 4-piece or a 5-piece with Billy. That's it. They're just learning the songs, and some of them are being captured on 8-track. But that's it. So when you've got the direct witnesses, participants in events, like John and George Martin, skewing it so much, that will be why we've always had we've always had a jaundiced view of this terrible month in their lives when they were arguing all the time. Yeah. They were not.
But it's also because of the film, because of the movie.
Yeah, that didn't help either. That's a very good point. That really didn't help. And that is also, we should now just talk about Spring '69, because the movie is, they've got all these cans of film, and Glyn Johns has got all this tape, and what are they going to do with it? And so February the 1st, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, one question about...
Long answers,
Peter Jackson is making a movie now.
Yes.
Well, maybe a positive movie, maybe a more positive movie.
It may well be. I think it has to be, because the moment you look at this film or listen to the recordings in totality, as I'm saying, a different picture does emerge. The thing is, when you're editing something, you can always skew history. And in a way, the Let It Be film skewed history to make us think that month was more bleak and more miserable than it actually was. He runs the risk, but I know he's aware of it, but the risk is there that he makes it more positive than it really was. Yeah. But I think if he just lets us see enough of it, we'll make up our own mind as to what it was. And that's what I did in January. I listened to all of it and changed my views almost completely.
What is the biggest pitfall for Mr. Jackson?
Well, if he's got complete editorial independence, there aren't any pitfalls. If he has interested parties who are paying his way, they're paying his fee, leaning over his shoulder, then there are potential pitfalls there. It depends how much of a free hand he's got. But
Do you know how much he's got?
But I don't know. I'm not involved in it at all. But I hugely admire the way that Apple Corps have reached out to someone with as much kudos and as much integrity as him to do it. They could have gone for somebody else who had a different track record. He seems to be the right man, and I don't doubt his integrity for a second. So full marks to Apple for even thinking of him, and full marks to him for taking it on. And we will see. I thought 8 Days a Week was not a good film. That had a big name director, but I thought it was safe and pulled punches and glossed somewhat. I think the Beatles should always be treated with complete honesty.
Yeah.
And I think if Jackson does, and I expect he will, then it will be great.
You said there's no bickering, but there's also can be a misery in not saying things to each other, like not communicating.
Yes.
George walked out at the middle of the sessions.
Yes.
So there were some arguments.
Tensions, yeah.
There were things going on. Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, those are facts. John is quite quiet through the early part of the month. Not the whole month, but certainly the early part of the month. He's quite subdued. He's not talking very much. He lets things be in a vacuum, if you like. But if you go back to 19, there's a lot of things in Tune In that relate directly to events that followed in later in the 60s. And one of them is that John Lennon always let people sort out their own differences. So he wouldn't necessarily, though he was nominally and actually the leader, he didn't hold an axe over anything. So if people have got a squabble, he lets them squabble, because they, why should he intervene? It'll work itself out, or they have to work out their own problems, basically, which is quite an interesting idea. And that's basically what's going on with Paul and George, and also John and George, and Yoko is undoubtedly a negative influence on them on events, because there's a couple of days wonderfully that we have recorded where they're sitting around just talking, and George isn't there because he's left, and John and Yoko haven't arrived yet, and they're not sure whether that John is coming, and they do talk about the negative impact of Yoko being there, but she doesn't make her presence felt very much during the month of January. You don't hear her very much. there is the period when they do, I think, 3 separate occasions she jams with them.
Yeah.
And Beatle people go, oh, it's the most terrible, she got her way, this was what she wanted all along. She wanted to edge somebody out, and as if Paul and John and Ringo or whoever was in this jam were doing it under sufferance. They weren't. You look at the film and they're happy to be, they're musicians. They'll jam. One of Ringo's albums that he feels most proud of is the Yoko Ono Plastic Ono Band album, which he thought was great. And his drumming on it is fantastic. And his drumming on her jam is fantastic. Her jam's in January 1969. So, and we're led to believe that George walked out because he couldn't stand Paul getting at him anymore, and he couldn't stand Yoko being around anymore, and John being a little bit passive-aggressive perhaps. But when he didn't want to do the TV show. Those are what we understand are the reasons why George walked out. But when George comes back, they're still talking about doing the TV show. Yoko is still there. John is talking more, much more, but that's a difference. And Paul is still giving him kind of instruction, but much, much less. There are great moments in January 1969 when you can hear Paul biting his tongue. When you know that he would be chipping into this bit of the conversation, but he's obviously stopping himself. So the things that the reasons we're led to believe, and I'm sure they're right, that caused George to leave are still in place when he comes back. And he has a very happy period in Savile Row. I did a tweet near the end of January, 25th, I think, where George is saying how much he's enjoying playing and how much he's enjoying the studio. No one bitches about Alex's equipment at all. In the whole 10 days or whatever it is at Savile Row that we have tapes of. No one said. They all say how much they're enjoying using the studio. Okay, they've had to bring in mobile gear because but when you look at the film of the studio, it's a proper studio. It's got
everything, I think.
It's got a control room. It's got a cutting room next door that's already up and running. It's got all the wiring is there. I mean, it wasn't put in overnight. There's great banks of electricity. So it wasn't that everything Alex did was wrong, but obviously he was overambitious in what he promised them, or what they believed he had promised them. And they just had to get mobile gear in. So big deal. But you would think in those 10 days you hear everyone go moaning about, bloody, this studio is meant to be our great studio, and look at it. They all say how much they enjoy using it, straight away, including George, who seems so happy in the last 10 days. So, most miserable sessions, it's not borne out when you play it.
Oh, revelation, I think. Yeah. Well, let's start now with the spring period, starting February 1st. Starts immediately with business troubles, because on that day there is a heated argument between Alan Klein and John Eastman. And it was obvious that the combination of these two men as manager and legal advisor was doomed from the start, don't you think?
Yeah. Yes, it was. Yeah. It was. It's funny how the Beatles were suddenly being advised by New Yorkers. And there's an American influence increasing. There's quite a few American employees at Apple. There's John Eastman advising them on counsel. Alan Klein just at this point being brought in to kind of look into their affairs. They needed that. And Yoko was Japanese American, and Linda was American. Yeah. And there's a shift. And Eastman and Klein were just destined. They were cut of different cloths. They had certain things in common in their background, but they were entirely different animals. And they were both going after the same goal, so it became a fight between them for the Beatles' best advice. Yeah, which wasn't helpful, but it was kind of inevitable.
I'm sometimes surprised by Paul putting his in-laws so forward like this. One of the stories that you write in Tune In, it made me think of that, because you write about Louise Harrison, the mother of George, who at one time wants to put Neil Aspinall aside and put her son Peter Harrison in place of him. And then John says, no, we're not going to have that, thank you, because we're just fine. And, well, there's an obvious problem when a near relative comes into play.
Yes.
I'm sometimes surprised because Paul seems to be the politically most sensitive Beatle that he put his in-laws forward like this in '69.
Yeah.
Was it maybe an error of judgment on his part?
I don't suppose he would see it that way. Very good, Michiel, for noticing that, because there is a very clear line between that anecdote in Tune In about 1962 and the events of early 1969. And I was conscious of that when I was writing it, and I wondered who would pick up on it. And you're the first person to say it. Because it was told to me by Neil Aspinall, and he knew what he was saying, because the same theory does apply. If you bring family in, then it changes things, because there's always the possibility of favoritism, or at its most basic level, if, as Neil said, if you want to tell, can I swear?
Sure, you can.
As Neil said to me, if you want to say, "Oh, fuck off, Neil," or, that's okay. But if it's Peter, "Oh, fuck off, Peter," and George would say, "Hey, don't talk to my brother like that," and then you've got a different kind of feel. You've got a different dimension to the discussion. So it changes things. So when Paul started going steady with Linda, it was natural that he met her family. Obviously, he went to New York and met her family. And it was natural, since the Beatles had a really great need for someone, and since they were clearly had skill in that direction, and certainly from a legal point, they were lawyers particularly, and the Beatles' contract situation did need sorting out. It was natural that Paul would say, "Well, maybe you could have a look at this for us," kind of thing. And all four Beatles did agree to John Eastman being their counsel. That's COUNSEL. It means someone who looks at the legal side of things. There is a letter of agreement that they allowed him to be that person for them because they did need somebody. But that didn't mean that they necessarily wanted him to manage their affairs, just that things needed to be looked at. When John met Alan Klein, that was a wholly different thing, because Alan Klein turned him on in a much more thrilling way and gave him every assurance that he understood the dilemma that the Beatles were in and could find a way out of the problems for them. So John didn't say, "I appoint you to be the Beatles business manager." He merely said, "You can look after my side of things." So that's all he did that night when they met. "You can look after my side of things." And then in the next few days, George and Ringo fell into line. This wasn't to the exclusion of John Eastman. They could coexist in theory. But Paul, obviously with the Eastmans in his ear, said that Klein is, I don't know how much they really knew about him, because it wasn't quite the world they operated in, but nonetheless, he had a reputation. If you read Variety, there was enough in there about Klein to know that he was an edgy player. And so they were probably advising Paul, not Alan Klein. You shouldn't be going with Alan Klein. So it fell into two camps, because George and Ringo sided with Klein along with John, and Paul wouldn't. And
there was no real
problem.
Alternative to Paul. Well, maybe there was, but the Eastmans were the most...
Well, they were never going... Although they had appointed the Eastmans as counsel, that was I don't know how it would have gone after that, but once Klein came in, they wanted him to be much more proactive. John Eastman was merely looking at things and advising, and Klein was going to be the one who was going out there to negotiate. Yeah. The thing is, Brian, with the Beatles' history, we'd parcel it up into this was 1963 and this was 1964 and so on. When you're living those lives, you don't see those lines so clearly. All through 1968, the Beatles need someone to replace Brian Epstein, who's only been gone for months. He's still not been gone for very long. And they're looking for Mr. X. And they've been looking for Mr. X for months now, and they've had various meetings with people, most famously Lord Beeching, who was the man who was cut great swathes of the British railway system that was costing and losing so much money, tried to make it more financially prudent. And then there were various other people that they spoke to, and they couldn't find the right person. And suddenly Klein becomes the Mr. X they've been waiting for, but one of them doesn't want him. and that is a huge issue that surfaces right at the end of the Get Back period. We actually have on film Peter Brown discussing with John and Yoko when they'll be meeting Klein. We'll meet him Friday. Oh no, we're meeting Monday night. Tell him we'll meet him Monday night. So we'll be there about 9 on Monday night. So you actually, it's as Peter Jackson's going to have now. We've got all this stuff to look at. It's fantastic how so much of their history was filmed and recorded. But that was the great schism. Then the Klein Eastman thing divided the Beatles. And it divided them in a way they hadn't been divided before, and it was an unbridgeable divide. And in the end, it broke them.
Yeah. You have also in that, I think in March, that Dick James sells his shares in Northern Songs to ATV. Can you tell us in short what went on there and why he didn't offer those shares to John and Paul to buy?
Yeah.
It involved a certain Mr. Lou Grade.
Yeah.
Who was he?
Yeah, Lou Grade was a great entertainment impresario, British, based mostly in Britain, but made a lot of international TV programs that were sold, particularly to America, but also around the world. Had a hand in every aspect of the entertainment business, from running theatres to TV to obviously lots and lots of live shows and films and all sorts of things. Record company, Pi Records was his record label. And he was a businessman, and Beatles songs were available on what we call the stock exchange, the British version of Wall Street, if you like. You could buy shares in Lennon and McCartney, and lots of fans did. I have now seen the register of who held shares in Northern Songs, and it's very interesting. Lots of fans have got just 10 shares each, kind of thing, and which is interesting. But there were millions of these shares, and obviously there can be takeover bids, and shares get traded, and people can build up portfolios of shares and so on. John and Paul never had more than about 30% between them, but Dick James and his partner had 37.5%, and the rest of them were held by institutions and investors and so on, as I've said, fans.
And Brian, maybe?
Brian had some, but they went to his mother Queenie when he died.
Yeah.
So there was,
and Paul had more than John.
There was suddenly a situation where the John and Paul had an agreement between themselves, just a verbal thing, of that they both held the same number of shares, and then there was a time in '69 when, with all the negotiations that were going on, and everyone had to put their things on the table and declare what they had. John saw that Paul had more and had bought more without telling him, so that wasn't a happy moment, I don't suppose. Which was, John mentioned it in a couple of interviews, so he was obviously a bit pissed off about it. But Dick James and his partner had 37.5%, so they decided to sell. They got out. Why did they get out? Because the Beatles were such a hot potato by 1969. John and Yoko, John appearing nude on a record cover, John being busted for drugs, John doing the bed-in, which, was obviously, from my point of view, a brilliant thing to do, but seemed to so many people to be so strange and cranky. They were all taking drugs to some extent or other, and long-haired, and they were rebels, and they had their own company, and they were belligerent. And when Brian Epstein was alive, Dick James had a cushion between him and the Beatles. His relationship was with Brian, and he would see the boys, come along to the session, drop in anytime you like, Dick, and Dick would, and he would be chummy and he would be nice, and then he would go. But without Brian there as the cushion, Dick James and the Beatles brushed up. They clashed with one another, and they were quite rough to Dick James. They brought him into Apple in May 1968 to Wigmore Street, and they put him through a tough meeting and filmed it, and then showed that film at an American record convention. Well, I can't imagine that would have gone down very well with Dick James. It's a terrible thing to have done, and that doesn't necessarily excuse what his selling of the shares, but it sets some context. Yeah. He felt he had less. He need show less loyalty to them at that point than he would have done in previous times.
And probably you could get more money from ATV than from John and Paul.
Probably so, and it was a business deal, and it didn't necessarily mean ATV were going to take over the company, because they still didn't have 50%.
No.
It was just he was getting rid of his shares. He was going to stay on as manager, hopefully, as if appointed, which he did, but he was going to get rid of his shares, which any shareholder is entitled to do. Morally speaking, of course, you wonder why it would have been the right thing to do to offer them to John and Paul first. Yes. But there were circumstances, so it's not quite as clear-cut as we think.
Let's hear John talk about the moment he heard it.
I was pissed off, you know. I mean, he's another one of them people, a bit like Martin, who think they made us, you know. And they didn't. I'd like to hear Dick James' music, and I'd like to hear George Martin's music, please. Just play me some. And Dick James actually has said that, you know, that he made us. They people are under a delusion that they made us, you know. He didn't tell us he did it. It was just a fait accompli, you know. He went and sold his thing to Lou Grade. That's all we knew. We read it in the paper, I think, you know. People seem to think businessmen like Alan O'Grade or any of them are not a race apart. They play the game the way we play music, you know. And it's something to see, you know. They play a game, you know.
Yeah, they play a game. It's business,
Yeah, well, that's that. As usual with John, that's exactly what he was thinking and what it really was. It was like that.
Yeah.
And Dick James wouldn't have meant that he made them, because he knew that they pre-existed. But in terms of their breakthrough, he was a key part of it for a while. There's no doubt at the end of Tune In and into '63 that the axis of Dick James as publisher, George Martin as producer or recording manager, and Brian Epstein as manager was a brilliant three-way combination that helped propel the Beatles. But obviously, when you've been involved in making something huge happen, there's a tendency to make it sound like you were more responsible for it.
Yeah.
And of course, that would piss them off.
Yeah.
So if they overheard him say that, or did hear him say it, straight to them, they would have been annoyed by that, because they existed before Dick James and the talent was theirs and theirs alone. But Dick was, because everyone wants to side with the Beatles all the time, because there's a natural inclination of fans to always want the Beatles' point of view, people like Dick James are painted as villains. But it's much more complex than that.
He was a Robin Hood.
Yeah,
right.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And the same with Magic Alex, and the same with Maharishi, and I've mentioned this in a few interviews now, that there are people who in Beatles history can be beaten up by writers, and that is an unbalanced way of looking at it.
Alan Klein?
Alan Klein as well.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not saying he was a saint. I mean, for goodness sake, his record is clear. But that doesn't mean that the way he's been reported is fair.
There's another interview with John. It's, I think, in NME, New Musical Express.
NME.
Yes. Yeah. And in this, John says, Paul and I are now working on a kind of song montage that we might do as one piece on one side. We've got 2 weeks to finish the whole thing, so we're really working at it. You can't say Paul and I are writing separately these days. We do both. When it comes to needing 500 songs by Friday, you gotta get together. I definitely find I work better when I've got a deadline to meet. It really frightens you, and you've got to churn them out. All the time, I'm sort of arranging things in my mind. First of all, it's so remarkable because he has an interview with a certain Alan Smith, who kind of bookends his career with the Beatles, because he was also present at the Please Please Me sessions, wasn't he?
He was from the Cavern, Alan Smith.
Yeah.
And he was at the Please Please Me album sessions. He was the one who suggested they did Twist and Shout. Yeah.
It's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Just turning back to the quote, this almost sounds like John and Paul of the good old days. Certainly a correction of the overriding view that from 1968 onwards, John and Paul are mainly writing by themselves.
What's the date of that interview?
It's the NME that appeared on the beginning of May, the 3rd of May 1969, and it was held at late April 1969.
Yes.
So already talking about the medley at this point.
Yes, it's clear that that's their thinking. It's a great insight into their thinking, because it's not on an actual level. If you look at the detail of what work they were doing in that period, you can't quite see that coming yet. But just to know that they were aware of it is interesting. On that subject, John Lennon had a press conference at the Bed Inn on the first day when he opened the doors and the press came in. And someone said, is there a new Beatle record coming out soon? And he says, yes, we've done about 12 tracks, and he's meaning the Get Back sessions. We've done about 12 tracks. Paul's in New York, I think, still, is he? And so we're all meeting up in about 7 days. So I've used these 7 days, which I knew was Beatle-free, to do this event and have a sort of honeymoon and to speak to you. When is this Beatles album going to be on sale? Well, we've got to go back, remix the 8 tracks, by which he means 8-track tape, not 8 tracks, and do 4 more tracks. So it should be around the summer, I suppose. So I was thinking about this. I took that quote and I analysed it. As far as the Beatles were concerned then, John is saying that the January 1969 sessions at Savile Row produced about 12 tracks. Then they recorded I Want You in February.
Yeah.
So that makes 13 or thereabouts. And he says they've got to do about 4 more. Well, that would make 16 or 17 songs in total, which they always thought 14 for an album. Any album they're doing, 14. And they always do more because they're going to do a single with it, A-side and B-side. So they're looking to do 16 or 17. So John is saying we need to do 4 more. And what that is confirmation that the sessions that the Beatles have in April 69 were meant to complete the Get Back LP. We look at them now as the beginning of the Abbey Road album, but in their mind, at that time, those tracks in April were for the completion of the Get Back LP, which became Let It Be. So what do? Well, they do the Ballad of John and Yoko, which is the single. They do Old Brown Shoe, which becomes the B-side. They do Something, but it's hard to know whether that was going to go on the LP, the Get Back LP. George has already got For You Blue on it, but maybe he would have had Something as well. Oh Darling is an April recording. Octopus's Garden, so that would have given Ringo a song on the Get Back, Let It Be LP. It's the only Beatles album that he doesn't have a vocal on, isn't it?
The Let It Be album, yeah.
Yeah, if you take out Magical Mystery Tour, because that wasn't an album, really.
Yeah.
Every album. So Let It Be album doesn't, so they were going to put Octopus's Garden on it. They do the Let It Be overdubs, and then they do You Know My Name. Now, I don't know whether that, to completion, I don't know whether that was going to be something for that or whether they were just finishing it off. And then in May, they start with You Never Give Me Your Money, and that, I imagine, could be where the medley idea is beginning. And Glyn Johns then goes away and assembles the Get Back LP. He's got all these tracks to choose from, but all he does is compile what they recorded in January. He doesn't include I Want You even, which was definitely part of the same set of sessions just 3 weeks later.
But he was asked to do it in the beginning of March, I think, to assemble an album.
Yes, he was. But he was involved. The other thing about these sessions in April is that George Martin was again not involved in them. It was still, again, Glyn Johns.
Yeah.
So in their mind, as John said, we're going back to complete the LP we've started. So these are the tracks that in their mind at that point, they're planning for the Get Back LP. And yet when Glyn compiles it, he doesn't use any of them. No. Probably under instruction on that basis. Otherwise, he would have done. Because why leave off, something? Or
instruction of whom?
Maybe then, yes, well, Beatles, I expect. It couldn't be anybody else. I mean, George Martin's just not in the picture. He's producer, but he's not involved. So
that's why Billy Preston played on.
That's why Billy Preston comes back and carries on playing.
Yeah.
So what we know as half the Abbey Road album was really in their minds at the point of recording for the album to complete Get Back, and that's in this period when they go and shoot the recreation of the cover at EMI House of Angus McBean.
Yeah.
That's also in this same period, and then when that gets shelved. And Glyn hasn't put those songs on anyway, not that it matters because they're not using it. They say, well, we'll use these for our next record then. And then the only time that Abbey Road really is a focused set of sessions for the album that we know to be Abbey Road is the sessions that begin on the 1st of July.
Yeah. But in the meantime, like 14th of April, you have the recording of the Ballad of John and Yoko.
Yeah.
But I think the day before or during that period, Get Back is released as a single.
Yes.
And why is that? Because they always released singles separately from an album. It ended up on the Let It Be album, but that's no discussion at this point.
Yeah.
Why release a single when there is no album yet backing it up or something?
Well,
that's
they did
the usual procedure.
Well, it became the usual procedure, but the Beatles would just release singles at periodic intervals. It was their longest ever interlude between records. They hadn't had a single out since Hey Jude.
That's true, yeah.
Which was the end of August, which means it was around through September and October. People always go on about the release dates, but the impact of Hey Jude, its presence high in the charts and on the radio and television, is September, October 68. Well, it's 6 months to April 69. 6 months, and they hadn't ever gone so long without releasing a record.
A single.
So they knew they wanted to put one out. They were aware of putting records out. That's what they did.
Yeah.
So they decided they needed a single out, and they chose Get Back with Don't Let Me Down, and Paul and Glyn Johns did the mix and did the remix when there was Paul heard it on the radio and didn't quite like the way it came over and went back in and remixed it.
Yeah.
That's April 69.
Yeah.
And then it was Rush issued the following Friday, I think.
Yeah.
Because they needed a record. It didn't matter whether there was an album to follow or not. It was just simply get a record out.
And then very quickly after that, the Ballad of John and Yoko was released.
The shortest interlude between two singles. They've gone from the longest to the shortest in the space of, immediate, really. Well, the Ballad of John and Yoko is the chronicle, isn't it, of like, March the 18th to April the 1st, something like that. March the 16th, I think, to April the 1st. That's what it is. It's a chronicle of that period.
I think it's so wonderful because in the same interview that I just quoted, John calls the Ballad of John and Yoko Johnny B. paperback writer.
Yeah.
Which is just a great way to put it.
It is. It is, yeah. And of course, as we now know, which wasn't known at the time, it's only two of them on it.
Yeah.
Just John and Paul.
They had a lot of fun.
Yes. Yes, it was
in the middle of the fights.
That's a crucial point because the one consistent thing that they've said from then to now is that they were always able to set aside their difficulties when they got into the studio, and it's true because again they came subsequently to describe the White Album as miserable sessions. That's where the rot set in, I think, was George's phrase for it. But when we heard Giles Martin's box set late last year, they seemed to be again cohesive and happy and productive, and they were. I mean, you can't make music as brilliant as that if you're not together. You just can't. They were obviously still capable, always capable of making great music together, irrespective of whatever might be going on outside the studio door. Paul and George were no longer anything like as close as they had been by the summer of 1969. But there was a period when John had been in the car crash and wasn't at the sessions, and Paul and George and Ringo were working on Abbey Road without him. And there are lots of Linda McCartney photos of Paul and George together at the microphone or working something out on guitars. Very happy photographs.
Yeah, they
perfectly happy photographs. And of course, they're making very beautiful music, so you can't do that in a state of anxiety. No, they could do it. They could just leave it outside. They always turned each other on musically. And we're the lucky recipients of that because even when they were having difficulty, the music was still wonderful.
You're saying they're having difficulty. I think that a month later, like half May, the problems are even bigger. Do you think, because there has been a clash between Paul and the other Beatles, at which he goes to the Steve Miller session, do you think the Ballad of John and Yoko could have been recorded like 15th of May or 14th of May, 1 month later?
Yes, I do. I still do. I still think they could have done it. The other thing is, apart from Ballad of John and Yoko, they also do You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, which when I first interviewed Paul, he said it was true of that day, if not forever. That's his favourite Beatles song. And I have to say, not just because Paul said it, but it's one of my favourites as well. It is just so brilliant for hearing their chemistry, their humour, their imagination, their originality. That was done in this same heavy period as well, when things weren't right for them. They're still capable of going in there and having a great laugh. What happened on the 9th of May was significant And in another interview I did with Paul, he described it as the great crack in the Liberty Bell, which was a very evocative, succinct way of putting it. Nothing was ever the same again after that evening for Paul. It changed. But a week later, he did an interview on BBC Radio Merseyside, which I think is on YouTube, with a man called Roy Corlett, who knew them for years. And he's speaking so positively about the Beatles and about John and about Yoko and about everything. And it's not a front. It's just he was able to still see the positive side of things. And I think they all were. And despite everything, the Abbey Road album was such a huge positive album. Yeah. It's such an upbeat, bright record. No sense of misery on it at all.
The Ballad of John and Yoko, you heard those sessions, of course, for your book.
Yeah, that was one I definitely did hear.
Yeah, because
I described that one. Yeah. Probably that entry isn't as embarrassing for me as the rest of them.
Because I was very happy when I read that. I can remember that because you describe a situation where John says to Paul, "Speed up, Ringo. Play faster, Ringo," and he said, "Okay, George."
Yes.
That's we all thought, well, they're bickering and fighting in this period, but there was love as well, and collaboration.
Yes, there was, and it's important to keep all this in mind. Now we know where Ringo was that day. He was shooting the film, but I'm not entirely sure why George wasn't there. I haven't ever. You asked earlier, are there things that I would like to... Yes, I'd like to know why George wasn't there. Did he know about it? Did he say he was busy? Probably. John was in a hurry to record it, and maybe George simply couldn't make it. Maybe he was working with Billy Preston. I think the sessions for Billy's album may have started by then. But anyway, it is just the two of them, and it's only the two of them on You Know My Name.
Why was John in a hurry? He said, I needed the money also for the single.
To earn money?
Yeah. Why was he in a hurry?
Oh, well, the money issue is a very complex one. He probably said that because it had been pointed out to him that his spending was greater than his income at a given point recently, perhaps, because he had been, the Beatles always spent quite freely, uninhibited. And in the spring of '69, with the bed in and suddenly flying to Vienna and staying in the Sash, I'm not saying that they couldn't afford the hotel bill, but their personal expenses were always itemized for them, and I've got a lot of those sheets now, including some for this period. And John was spending much more than the other Beatles, so he had it to spend. But Klein may have said to him, we need to increase your income if you're going to be spending at this rate. It may have been just a comment like that caused John to say it. Because if you do make a record and it sells, you don't see the money for a while. You don't get it the next day. Fans don't come and give you the money for the record. It goes through a process of going to the shop, to the record company and the distributors and so on. Like book publishing, it's the same thing. So...
And the hurry?
But the hurry was because it was the first of what he called his newspaper songs, right? It was here's what I've done and I want to get this out. This is current. This is news. I want to report this. Instant Karma was another one like that, and that's about communication. This is my song. This is my art. There's no reason why, especially being the huge as they were, and they could dictate their own terms. There's no reason why I can't go and record this song today and get this out next week. And in fact, I'd like that. That's the thinking there. And it's quite an understandable one for a creative artist to want to have his work out. Why let it sit in the can for months? It was contemporary. It was reporting current news. It needed to be out straight away.
Can we just go back to that day of May the 9th?
Yeah, I'm glad you had, because I didn't talk about
you said the crack in the Liberty Bell.
Yeah.
What is a Liberty Bell, anyway?
A Liberty Bell...
The Dutch
Liberty Bell is, I think it's this
it.
great big bell on a ship that you would clang at given moments. I'm sorry, I should know the exact definition. Look it up, and I will as well. But I knew what he meant when he said it. It was this important thing that embodies everything that they have together. They are this great thing, and it's got a crack in it that night, meaning it couldn't be repaired again. And the crack was that the previous day, Alan Klein was representing the Beatles in a lot of tricky business things that were happening coincidentally in spring '69. There was the Northern Songs business. There was what would happen to NEMS Enterprises, Brian Epstein's company, which was also being fought over, not publicly, but privately. And there were other issues. There was a renegotiation to be had with the record company, and they wanted to whip EMI and Capital into more clearer reporting of sales and such like. So Klein was having to go into battle on their behalf and at their request, but he didn't have a mandate from them. He didn't have a piece of paper that actually said, I represent these people and you are commanded to turn over your information so that I can study it. He was their representative, but he couldn't show a piece of paper. He didn't have anything in writing from them, and it was obvious that he needed one, and they recognized it too. So a piece of paper was drawn up, a single sheet of paper with about, you can see it on the internet, it's got about, 4 clauses in it. Something like that, 5, whatever. It's just one side of paper, in which they appointed him to be their business managers, and it set out, a rate of commission, which Paul argued, and he was right to argue, but that was part of the discussion. And then John signed it, and George signed it, and Ringo signed it, and Paul wouldn't sign it. And yet, Paul needed that someone needed to go and fight for them, and Paul was, it seemed, not signing the document that would enable their warrior to go into battle. And so it came to an emergency board meeting of Apple, which was held at Olympic Studios in southwest London when they were finishing the Get Back album, if you like. It was that session on, May the 9th. Well, it was the week of You Never Give Me Your Money, and I think they were doing other songs that week. And Paul wouldn't sign it. And then there was business of Klein needed it by that weekend. Paul did explain it to me, and he's done it in various other books as well. But the Beatles they'd always existed on the principle of all or nothing, unanimity or nothing. If we don't all agree to do something, it won't happen. And the great crack in the Liberty Bell is that night when Paul wouldn't sign, John, George and Ringo said, well, okay, that really, 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 really is a pity, but 3 of us have and we're the majority and it's going to go through. That was the crack in the Liberty Bell. The unanimity thing went that night.
Decisions were never made that way within the Beatles.
Actually, there probably had been 2 or 3 times, but they were times when they could live with them. I think the Jimmy Nicol thing, George didn't want him, but was persuaded to go out on tour with a Ringo replacement. But that was more pragmatic, and he came to regret that. I think in the anthology he implies that we were trodden on, that we couldn't make his decisions for ourselves, implying that in later years, given the same choice, he would have said no to Jimmy Nicol and cancelled the tour until Ringo was better. So that was the night when it really counted, though, because it was about the direction of the Beatles' business, which was crucial because, potentially, they were going to, they might end the 60s with nothing like what they should have had financially. So, that was the night. And then, amazingly, Glyn Johns, who's at the session, is also Steve Miller's producer. And Steve Miller's there in session as well, and they go into another studio, and Paul and Steve Miller jam with Paul on drums and do My Dark Hour. I mean, how much more apt could it possibly be? And it's a great track. It
is, yeah. Well, also in this period in spring '69, there are 2 major events. Of course, the marriages of John and Paul within 8 days of each other.
Yes.
And I read that John wanted to marry on the 14th, but 2 days after Paul's wedding, but couldn't do it because of legal issues. How much was his marrying a response to Paul's quick marriage, you think?
I've read that people say that it was, but I've never heard John say that it was. So there's no validity to those claims. They're just people assuming that John didn't want to be outdone by Paul. Which I think that's the kind of writing that annoys me, because it becomes part of the fact, and it's just some writer thinking that's what it probably was. Unless somebody out there can find a Lennon quote in which he says it, in which case I stand corrected and very happy to do so.
But it is remarkable.
It is. Well, John's divorce came through in January. There's a moment in the Get Back sessions when he says, I'm finally divorced. Or is it Yoko's divorced? John's divorce is already clear.
Yeah,
it's Yoko's divorce that comes through, yeah. And Paul was obviously free to marry, as was Linda. She was divorced because Paul hadn't married yet. But Linda was pregnant, which these days is no cause for marriage anymore. And indeed, he was free to do as he chose, but they chose to be married because it meant Linda could stay in the UK. She was American, and she couldn't stay forever unless she was married.
Yeah.
And obviously, she was pregnant. They were going to have the child in England and raise it in England. So they married before her pregnancy bump got too large, just as Ringo had with Maureen and John had with Cynthia. It was the same kind of
traditional guys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's what you did. And Yoko and John married because they wanted to marry. Now, whether it was because Paul and Linda married, I doubt it. Yeah. I doubt it. But maybe, I don't know. Maybe it was in their minds somewhere.
Do you know why any of the other Beatles were not invited to those weddings? Because George was in London, could have gone to Paul's wedding.
Yes. Well, they knew about it.
Yeah.
But Beatles they had long since come to the realization, it had been impressed on them vividly, that when they went around as a foursome, it was a hard thing to handle. And if you could do something without the necessity of having all four Beatles there, it would be easier. Now, they still made the marriage public, though, so there was still a lot of people there, because Paul does like to have a lot of people at things. And it was in the papers the day before that they would be married the next day.
Oh, really?
So there was a lot of people there.
Yeah.
And
there was a lot of almost Beatlemania outside.
Well, there was, and the Beatles were always aware, John, George and Ringo were always aware that amongst girls, Paul had the most fans. They all had fans, and they all had fans of both genders, but girls tended to go for Paul. So while he was unmarried, there was hope for these girls. I know, as ludicrous as that may sound, but in the girls' minds, it was not impossible.
My daughter thinks she can marry Justin Bieber, so it's just the usual thing, I think.
It is, yeah. And it was caused a great upset to them that he married, and it was great for the TV crews because they could show all these weeping girls on the steps of the registry office, just in tears that Paul had married her. And those tears were real. I'm not going to downplay them. They were genuinely upset, but there was part of their growing up that they were in that moment at that time shedding those tears. And it was part of Paul's growing up that he was inside getting married to an interesting, bright, talented woman.
In contrast, John's marriage was in complete silence.
No, yes, absolutely. Well, he didn't want any fuss around it. We know from Ballad of John and Yoko that they were at the dock of Southampton trying to get to Holland or France. So, in theory, he could have married in the Netherlands. But I don't think the boat was sailing. And he was at Southampton anyway, and the boats for Netherlands go from Harwich. Not from Southampton.
But you have to be a resident for at least 2 weeks in the Netherlands to marry. So
that's right.
He was in a hurry.
And then, these obstacles began to arise. So Peter Brown in the office in London was looking into where they could marry without the hindrance of 2 week residences and so on. So Gibraltar was the answer. And they were in Paris. They had their honeymoon before they married and after, but mostly before, and flew from Paris to Gibraltar, not the lightning trip, that's Vienna, but they flew to Gibraltar. Peter Brown called to say, you can make it, you can get married in Gibraltar near Spain. And off they go to Gibraltar, and I've been to the place where they were married on Gibraltar. It's just a quiet little office, and no one knew they were coming. They flew in, went straight there, went straight back to the airport and flew out.
Why not in England? It wasn't exotic enough, or?
I don't know. It could have been in England, but why not go and do it somewhere else? Yes.
Peter Brown says you want to do it in silence. You don't want any public.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, so it was easier. You could just about manage a quiet wedding in England, but you would have to post a notice at some point, at which point it could become public. So that was a good way of doing it, and it was discreet and got them what they wanted without any fuss. And Peter Brown, who is now 82, is still very much with us, and I've been talking to him this week about Amsterdam. And
Really?
about Gibraltar and all of that. Yeah, he was
He
the
was
only
a
man common to both weddings. He was John's best man, and he organised Paul's wedding, and he was going to be a witness to it. But at the last minute, Paul said, "No, it's going to be Mal and Mike," and Peter was there, but not actually official. But he was at both.
Peter Brown was a week before in Amsterdam, around the 14th of March.
Yes. I asked him about that, and he couldn't really remember very much about it. He thought he might have been over for a concert, but the book, your book, says that, in fact, we've been emailing about it, haven't we? Because I've been trying to find out why he was here, and in order to tell Peter why he was here, because he can't quite remember, which is understandable after 50 years. It wasn't a Liverpool Philharmonic concert, though, because they don't appear to have been in the Netherlands, but it was some reason he was here, to see a concert, probably.
Yeah.
If you find out any more, let me know and I'll tell Peter.
Okay, I'll let you know.
Check the concert archives.
Ja, heb ik gedaan.
We are.
I've done that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark, we didn't talk a lot about George and Ringo. Tell us a little bit. What did they do in those days?
Well, I can hear George going, I was busy being a Beatle. They were so incredibly active. Ringo went straight from the January 1969 filming into making a movie, The Magic Christian. Only the second, after the Beatles films, only the second film in which he had an acting role, and by far the biggest. Though there wasn't a huge amount for him to do, he was in a lot of scenes, so he had to be on call a lot. So that was Ringo, and he was writing songs in this period. One of the things you get from the January 69 sessions is that he's beginning to write songs. Don't Pass Me By has been a bit of a key for him, just to, he can now do a second one and do a third one and do a fourth one, whereas doing the first one was tough. He's less intimidated by the process now, but obviously not so musical on on melodic instruments that he can really come up with full songs. He needs help. There's a delightful sequence in the Let It Be film. Actually, the Let It Be film does have many up moments, and one of them is when George is helping Ringo find his way through the composition of Octopus's Garden. Yeah. And then John arrives and gets on drums, and George Martin arrives and does some harmonies. And that's a lovely moment. And he's got one or two other songs up his sleeve as well, which we never really get to hear, except that you hear bits of them, fragments. And he's around Apple, and he's part of all this Alan Klein business. He's well involved in things, Ringo, but filmmaking is what occupies him through the spring period, and it finishes around May, I think, Magic Christian. And that's, again, when the Beatles kind of resume. As John said, I did the Amsterdam bed-in because the Beatles have got a week off. They were such hard-working guys that they would have a kind of a schedule mapped out. And they would be, if Ringo's going to be filming that week and George is busy with Billy, I can go away and do something.
How did Ringo think about Alan Klein? What was his thoughts about him?
Wanted him.
Yeah?
They all knew they needed someone. Though Neil Aspinall was very, very good at everything he did, and though John Eastman was in advising them on what contractual situations they were in, they didn't have anyone to go out there and beat some heads together. And like all artists, you reach a point in your time, in your career or whatever, where you are irritated that your music publisher has a Rolls Royce, where you're irritated that your record producer has a boat, and so on. Because you can't help but think, I've made that money. That's my money. I should have that money. All artists, somebody once explained it to me. If you say you're a new musician and you're forming a band and you want to play somewhere, and someone says to you, I'll get you a gig, and it's €10, and for that I'll take €1, 10%, And you go, yeah, great, yeah, we get to keep €9. And then you get to a €100 gig and the manager keeps €10 and you think, yeah, fine, well, he got us the gig, of course. Then you get to a €1,000 gig and the manager's keeping 100 and you're thinking, don't know if he's really, should he be keeping should he really have 100? 100 for that, really? When you get to 1 million and more, so should he really have 100,000? Should he really have a Rolls Royce just because I've written that song and he was in the room and produced it or whatever? That is inevitable with all artists. So by 1969, they're all thinking, we got to make some more of this money that we've been making. We're watching other people with their boats and their cars and everything and their nice houses. What about us? And we're due more. And Alan Klein was, for Ringo, as well as for George and for John, the man who was going to go and get them what was rightfully theirs. So he was very much pro-Alan Klein and stayed pro-Alan Klein till about 72.
Yeah. Because Peter Brown wrote on the 9th of May, Paul hoped Ringo was on his side.
Yeah, I can't think why. Because Ringo's been on Alan Klein's side. But, I mean, Peter said that. He would have a reason for saying it. In these situations, you're looking for allies, aren't you? I mean, I'm speaking to you in the midst of the most disastrous Brexit non-negotiation, just an absolute foul-up of monumental proportions that's happened to my country and by people who are meant to be representing us. You're looking for allies. Everyone's looking for allies. You're looking to form alliances in order to win the day and get your point of view across. And Paul obviously knew he couldn't get John as an ally on Alan Klein, and he wasn't going to get George. So he must have hoped that Ringo would be on his side and probably tried to focus his attentions on winning Ringo around, because if it was 2 against 2, that would be different. But Ringo did want Alan Klein and did sign and was happy to be around Klein until pretty much the end of the relationship. George was also pro-Alan Klein for the same reasons. It's like, all these people with their Rolls Royces, you know, I mean, where's my... Well, in fact, he had his too, but... Well, he had his Mercedes, but... Artists will think that way. It's just inevitable. It's not just the Beatles. It's everybody who makes money. You end up resenting others making it from you. And the Beatles have had a thing about people earning money off them since 1963. They didn't like it then. They didn't like how much Hunter Davis got for writing his book, and held it against him. And that's the way it is. Even though they've got plenty, it's just like, well, it's still our money, you know. So.
There's also another side to this, maybe, that there were other people who were doing things for the Beatles every day, but who weren't getting paid very much. People like Neil, George Martin, Mel Evans.
Well, George Martin was doing all right.
Yeah,
but the Beatles didn't pay particularly well. The Ron Cass, the man who brought in to run Apple Records, he was on a really grand salary because they felt they needed someone of that magnitude. But generally speaking, Apple paid averagely to its staff. It didn't pay high wages. If you worked for Apple, you weren't necessarily rolling in money. And Mal and Neil were never on very much, but they were looked after. You know, they bought a house for Neil and they bought a car for him and things like that. When Neil married, they gave him a flat in Knightsbridge, which was a great thing to give, a great wedding gift for a man and his wife. So George... In January 69, there's this lovely moment when Billy Preston comes in, and within a day, George is talking to him about producing an album with him. Within a day, and we'll find you a place to live, and we'll get some musicians in. And he's so positive and constructive about it. And so George gets involved in becoming a record producer.
For Billy Preston in first instance.
For Billy and then Doris Troy. 2 albums with Billy and Doris Troy.
He had a special relation with Billy from years before.
Well, they all did. They knew Billy back to 1962 and liked him and, of course, admired his talent because it was wonderful. A myth about Let It Be is that when Billy came in, it just elevated the whole thing because that's what they always said, you know, somebody else in the room, everybody behaved better. But in fact, it was all right before he came in and on the days when he couldn't, because once he came in, he wasn't there every day. He was in England to make a TV special, so he had to go to the TV studio. So even from when he arrives at Savile Row, he's not at every session. And when he's not there, things are perfectly fine without him as well. So again, that's a bit of a myth that they created. But George is very happy. He's also, however, busted for drugs.
Yeah.
On Paul's wedding day, which was a mean thing to do by the British police, who were definitely out to get a Beatle, another Beatle. They had one already in John. They wanted to arrest another one.
Mr. Pilcher.
Yeah, Detective Sergeant Pilcher, who brought some of his own just to be on the safe side, as it said in the Ruttles. And as Monty Python also spoofed wonderfully as well, with this great clod-hopping British Bobby comes in, and we're looking for drugs, and clearly there aren't any, and he gets something big thing out of his pocket, and then goes, "Oh, what's that?" Because they found this big lump of hashish in George's boot, in his wardrobe, and as I loved his quote. He says, "I'm a tidy man. I keep my ties in my tie drawer, I keep my socks in my sock drawer, and I keep my hash in the hash box on the table."
That's great.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
He's a clean man, like the washing of the car, right? That's
Yes. He's an organised, orderly man. Yes.
Yeah.
So why is he going to keep his hashish in his boots? But that's where the police found it, and he was planted.
Yeah.
He was planted, and this is what was going on in these days. The 60s was ending ugly, and what had been beautiful was now being attacked, because they were, these musicians needed to be whipped into line. They were getting too unruly. They were stirring things up, and all the Beatles were, and obviously they saw John Lennon as a fomenter of trouble, and he made the establishment fearful, and they started to use the instruments of state against him and other prominent musicians in that period, and it was ending in an ugly way, unfortunately. And to bust him on Paul's wedding day was just a horrible thing to do as well. And I was just looking through my archive, because as I said, I don't have originals of very many things. My collection isn't intrinsically valuable. It's valuable for a collection of information. Mm-hmm. And I have a scan of an autograph that George gave outside the courthouse on the day that he was the verdict was given. I think he was fined £500. Could have gone to prison for being busted. That was a possibility. The judge had it within his power to send him to prison, but he didn't, just fined him. And George wrote on this. There were fans outside the courthouse, of course, and George probably didn't sign many autographs, because you see him get into the car and go, but he did sign at least one. And it says something like, "From George Harrison, now a criminal." And he deeply resented the fact that he had been got like that, for something that he wasn't even guilty of. I mean, yes, he smoked hash, but so bloody what?
Yeah.
He's not selling it. He's not dealing in it. No. Outrageous thing to do.
Did he have the same legal problems as John had for entering America?
Absolutely. They both lost their American visas. And for both of them from that point on, it was always a struggle to get back in. Yeah. And they would have to get special dispensation, and they would have to, swear this and, I don't know, put bonds down perhaps. And yeah, it's funny, when at the end of the 60s, literally in 1969, two of the Beatles can no longer enter America.
Yeah, and they busted John and George, but not Paul and Ringo.
Yeah.
That's also
I don't know why George and not Paul. Paul was obviously a smoker. But he was busted in Scotland instead, and Sweden and
That's
America,
true.
but never in England. He was busted. His busts were 1970s busts.
Yeah.
But in the 60s, it was just John and George. But Ringo's never been busted.
No.
Before we go further into the drugs story, can you give a little bit more detail on what George is into? Because you said he's into production jobs of Doris Troy and Billy Preston.
Yes, well, he's writing a lot of songs. A stunning takeaway for me from the January '69 is that how prolific George had become suddenly. It seems most days he's coming in with a song he wrote. I wrote this last night, and it's another new song and another new song. He and Paul are by far the most prolific. And he wants to produce. He wants to be. George underwent an epiphany in America in June '68. He went out there to help Ravi film the Raga, and he goes out and there's that clip that we know of the two of them, colour film of them sitting on a cliff top somewhere with the ocean, the Pacific in the background, learning the sitar. The reality is that trip to America was where George got back into the guitar, not the sitar. And he comes back through New York and he gets a new guitar and he hangs out with Eric and with Jimi Hendrix a little bit, Eric Clapton, and suddenly he comes back a guitarist, and 69 he just wants to play guitar all the time. So he's writing songs and he's recording demos and he's in the studio with Apple artists and he's playing on their records as well as producing them. I mean, producing was a new thing for him right there. And then he's also becoming submerged very happily in the Krishna movement. 69 is George's first big Krishna year. You don't hear him mention it much before 1969, but in 69 he records the Hare Krishna mantra with the Radha Krishna Temple, which is a wonderful record that came out on Apple and made the charts. And the Hare Krishnas were on top of the pops on British television, and I remember seeing it, and I'd never seen people look like that before. It was a completely new thing for me that people could look like that and make that noise. Beautiful record, and I'm so glad he made it. And he was just developing in so many ways, George. The Beatles could no longer contain their ideas. They had to have other outlets.
Yeah, he recorded 3 demos, right, on his birthday.
Yes.
What do you think? Why didn't he record? If you want to record demos at home, why he booked Abbey Road Studios with Ken Scott as an engineer?
Yes.
Why do you think he chose to record demos at Abbey Road? Was it to present John and Paul with, look what I've got now, or?
I don't know. In the first instance, it could. I don't know.
No.
I mean, he's been presenting songs to them throughout January, and the received wisdom on that is that they were rude to him about his songs, John and Paul, that they slighted them and paid no particular heed to them. Actually, I didn't really hear that so much. I think that's been exaggerated. When I listened to the tapes, I was listening for that and I didn't hear it. And when I read the books that said this is what they did, I didn't quite... even having read it and I listened again, I still didn't hear it. Not quite as written. There's a great moment at the end of January. Paul is out of the room, 28th, 29th, I'm thinking, something like that, when George says to John, I think I might do an album of, I've got all these songs. I think I'll just do an album. Yeah. And John says, great, you should do it. Encouraging. But George doesn't do it. Now, whether the February thing is a step towards the plan that didn't happen, I don't know. Right. It's interesting that he only put up 2 songs for Abbey Road because he had about 15 that he could have done. But in not putting them up, he obviously knew he'd be doing something else with them, and it was just a matter of time. Yeah. I maintain that the Beatles don't become... the solo years don't begin when the Beatles break up, that there is an overlap with the Beatles group as a collective. Why should it be that this only starts when that one finishes? There is actually an overlap. The solo years begin in 68. That's when they're all now, and actually by, I'm sure, verbal agreement, we'll do this and we'll do whatever we want to do. And that whatever we want to do meant Paul could go off and produce Mary Hopkin, play on it, whatever, Black Dyke Mills band, write Thingamy Bob and go and produce it up north with a brass band. And George could do Wonderwall and John could do Two Virgins and so on. They were still Beatles and they were still intending to keep Beatles, but they would also now do other things under their own names. So the solo years and the Beatle years overlap.
It fits in nicely with an interview I think John gave in Melody Maker, in which he says, well, we'll be together, just wait and see until we're 60. Just not as tight, but with other outlets.
Yes. Yeah. And arguably, without the business thing, that could have happened. Yeah. The business thing was too fundamental to... That was the real cause of the breakup, because artistically, as we've been discussing, they could always get it together. Yeah. And it would have been fine for them to be like a lot of bands would become, which they do their solo things and every once in a while they'll come together and do a band album. Yeah. That would have been fine. But the business thing was the wedge that prevented it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in one of other interview you said that the Beatles breakup began as soon as they formed.
Yeah.
You said these guys were never going to be in one band for the rest of their lives.
Yes.
But you don't mean they were going to dissolve in the end, but I think you mean the richness of their ideas and their creative outlets would not have been contained in one unit.
That's right. That's exactly what I mean. And also the fact that the Beatles, in a sense, they tried to make it be this unlimited thing, that it could be anything, but it was still a construction. And like all constructions, it was holding something inside it. And somewhat constricted them, this construction, he said alliteratively. Because, as George said, when they were in the room together, they did kind of they knew each other so well by this point. The other great turn-on for George, which immediately precedes the Get Back sessions, so-called, the January 69 sessions, is his hanging out with the band, Bob Dylan and the band in America, in November 68. That changes everything because he sees the way the band operate as a band. And the freedoms that they allow, at that point at least in their time together, that they allowed one another within the creative construction. So when he came back to be with the Beatles, where they were, as George said, had pigeonholed each other inevitably because they knew each other so well, you can do this and you can do that and so on, that they had lost that sense of exploration because they knew each other so well.
Yeah. We talked about drugs, George's bust, but John was also heavily into drugs at this point. He had a heroin addiction. Do you think his drug use, what kind of effect did it have on his art and on his relationship with the other guys?
Heroin was a drug that the Beatles were always aware of and had steered clear of. George Harrison, bunking off school one day in Liverpool in about 59, filling time because he could only go home at home time but had to fill the hours that he wasn't at school, went into a cinema and saw The Man with the Golden Arm, the film. And it was about heroin addiction, and it frightened him. And he knew he would never have heroin. But they were always aware that heroin was this really evil drug. They didn't, marijuana and hashish, they didn't really consider drugs. Drugs were what we would now call opioids, LSD, heroin, and so on. But having a smoke, as George said, was like having a couple of beers. So when they saw John begin to get into heroin, they were disappointed and a bit concerned. But John Lennon was always on his own journey. And they knew, of course, that John Lennon was one of those guys in life who wants to know everything, try everything, find out what it's like by trying it, and then you'll know whether you want to do it again or not. Now, you called John a heroin addict. I don't believe he was ever addicted. I don't see the signs of an addict there. And in fact, I'm not so sure how many times he took it. He ended up writing the song that suggests that he was addicted, Cold Turkey. Yeah. Incredible song. And so revealing because no one knew he was taking heroin, and he writes a heroin addictions withdrawal song and puts it out as a record. I don't know whether at that point he had actually gone through that experience. He probably had to know it, but that suggests a stronger addiction than there's any indication of.
Yeah, I think he had a relapse after Cold Turkey into heroin again.
Yeah.
With Yoko. Yeah.
Well, the suggestion is that George said that Yoko got John into heroin and they didn't like her for that. But I don't think she was an addict either. But there's no sign that either of them was. I mean, they functioned to such a high degree.
Yeah.
I mean, John is so creative. OK is not writing many songs at the start of 69, but you look at John Lennon's performance, most of January he's fine. Savile Row, he seems completely clean. He's not strung out on heroin the whole month like I've read. He's not at all. The bed-in, he's so switched on. He's definitely not doing any heroin in Amsterdam.
No.
Maybe very late at night when the room finally is cleared and finally the two of them are alone after another extraordinary day of their room being full of people. They might have a smoke. There is an allusion in one of the films to thanks for the grass, whatever. It was nice. Yeah. Which is, newlyweds probably after an exhausting day make love and have a joint and go to sleep. Fine. Yeah. I don't think they're doing heroin.
But he's so lucid.
He's so lucid. He's so on top of it. He's not in. It never drops the ball at any point, and it's the same in Montreal. I think he has a heroin problem again in New York in '71 too. There's a story of them going cold turkey in a car being driven across America, that they put themselves in a car and told the driver to drive, and they would go through their hell in the back of the car, and when they arrive at the destination, they're over it, which must have been a trip and a half. But nonetheless, so I think it's very easy to be frightened of the word heroin and its potential, and to assume that John was strung out on heroin the whole time, and it's very evident that he was not. He's far too creative and lucid doesn't exhibit any signs whatsoever of being strung out. In fact, in Twickenham, I think it's the 14th of January, it's the last day at Twickenham, John begins the day with an interview set up the day before with Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, principally about Yoko's events, but of course, because the guys with John, he wants to talk about the Beatles and things. And John is kind of green in this interview, and he's clearly unwell, and in fact he goes off to throw up. And we know that he's thrown up because he comes back and says, "I've just thrown up." There's no secrets with these guys. They told us everything. And then he's a bit more together. His speech becomes a little bit unglued, and he just becomes a little bit more together. And at the end of that day, he says to Paul and Ringo, because George isn't there, he's quit at that present time, he says to Paul and Ringo, I took something last night I shouldn't have done. And if you look, the day before, they've had this, in all the Ethan Russell photographs that we have of that shoot at Twickenham, there's a picture of some guys around the Beatles, and one of them is Tony Sanchez. Now, he was Keith Richards. He was heroin supplier to the Stones. And he turns up on the 13th of January, and that night they do heroin, and the next morning John is green, and then he throws up. So there's a clear chronology there. They've got it from Tony, and they've taken it, and he's not well. But he says, he kind of doesn't say he regrets it, but he says, I took something, shouldn't have done. Yeah. But there's no indication that he takes it again. Yeah. So I don't think the word addiction should be applied. I think he was in control of it rather than the other way around.
Mm. Joe Gooden, he wrote the book about the Beatles and their drug use.
Yes.
And he just sums up what Lennon is doing in '69. It's just incredible.
Yes.
Not only the bed-ins, but making several films, making several albums, conducting numerous TV and radio interviews, launching the War is Over poster campaign.
No,
getting married, going to Vienna, Montreal, Amsterdam. It's impossible to do this while you're just tripped all the time.
Absolutely right. Yeah. But I mean, I dare say some of that could be done under the influence. But the impression you always have from films and things is if heroin users is slumped in a chair somewhere undergoing some kind of hell.
Yeah.
And you just don't get that at all. No. But in private moments, yes. But they were so public in '69. I mean, it was the most incredible year of their marriage. They went full tilt into everything in '69. Yeah. And the whole peace campaign, they were so determined and so dedicated to it and so convinced of it. And again, this is not the behaviour of drug addicts. Yeah. There's a great moment at Savile Row in January '69. You're listening to these tapes, you really get it all. At one point, George calls out to Mel, get us a joint and a pill. Right? So that's interesting. So he took probably an upper of some kind and smoked a joint at the same time. Yeah. And that's just functioning stuff. That's not to crash. That's to just carry on working. They can function on that.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question because you just talked about the bed-in. I get this feeling that the Montreal bed-in was a bit more, well, let's say less peaceful than the Amsterdam one. Is that impression right?
The Amsterdam one took everybody by surprise. Nobody knew that it was happening until it began. And it was a first, so it was a novelty as well. But the second one was a bigger deal, if you like. It was more mad. It was in Canada. It was in Montreal. So it was North American media. Yeah. A lot from America. He wanted to do it in America and couldn't get in, so he did it in Canada to go to America by radio and television, as well as to Canada, which was a country that he was very fond of. But it was a second event, and because people knew what it was altogether more crowded and more manic. Also filmed, of course, also recorded. They were filming and recording everything. They were chronicling their lives, which is so brilliant for historians or just fans, students. And they invited in belligerent people. They invited in people who were going to argue it because they were up for the intellectual rigour of the argument, as indeed they did in Amsterdam. The Amsterdam version of Al Cap was Donald Zeck of the British newspaper, the Daily Mirror.
They knew him from '63.
They knew him well and knew exactly what kind of a man he was and what kind of an article he was going to write, and still they invited him in because they were happy to invite in people with a contrary position, which is an unusual thing to do when you think about it. Most people don't want to be challenged. They want to just state their point of view, but they were inviting challenge in and inviting rudeness in, and that's what they got from both Cap and Zeck.
It's a wonderful thing to do. I love John debating with these guys.
Yes.
He's just so on it.
And they weren't listening.
No. It's so easy to just look at them as a kind of naive hippies, but his theory and why he's doing the bed-in is just all clear for himself.
Yes. There was one thing about the bed-in which didn't quite work. For me, I buy almost all of it, and in fact, I do buy all of it, but maybe John didn't realise, or maybe he did, that the very act of protesting in that way, of being in bed for a week, became the story and not the message. Yeah. The medium got in the way of the message. Everyone wrote about the bed-in. They're sitting in bed, the room service comes in and they take their breakfast, and that got reported as much as the message that he was trying to deliver about peace, and that was unfortunate. Yeah. But nonetheless, I think they were both conceptually brilliant ideas, true Lennon-Ono or Ono-Lennon ideas, 50-50 arrangements. And great thing to have done, and a beautiful way for them to end the 60s. I said it was ending ugly, and it was in a sense, but to have John Lennon urging peace is a pretty good way to end a decade.
Like the message was important for him, and the way he conveyed that message wasn't that important, because he thought, well, peace is the message I want to.
Yeah.
And he has a
like soap.
Sell like soap. He has a wonderful quote about it.
That's part of our policy, is not to be taken seriously, because I think our opposition, whoever they may be in all their manifest forms, don't know how to handle humour, and we are humorists. We are, what are they, Laurel and Hardy, that's John and Yoko, and we stand a better chance under that guise, because all the serious people like Martin Luther King and Kennedy and Gandhi got shot. We're willing to be the world's clowns.
Yeah. What a thing to say, and then shot, dead, murdered, assassinated 11 years later.
Yeah.
11.
Incredible, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people talk about John Lennon dying. He did die, of course, but he was murdered. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. He was murdered. A Beatle was murdered, and almost a second one was.
Yeah.
I don't quite know what the point I'm making there, other than the fact that we needn't dress it up in soft words, because it's important to keep an eye on the reality of it all. And he was aware of it there. He was putting himself in the line. I don't know that his murder had anything to do with the bed-ins. It was 11 years later and a lot of things had happened. But nonetheless, he's saying there that, if you make yourself prominent and visible, you can be shot.
Yeah. Well, we don't want to end on such a low note, right? What's from the spring of 1969? What's the most important thing that happened, or the most beautiful thing that happened, do you think? Despite all the legal problems and
probably the most beautiful thing is that as individuals, and let's face it, this group was for individuals always, they didn't just become individuals at the end, that they were developing in ways that they were finding their own paths, and you can't beat that. If you've got, in Paul's case, a domestic pleasure, happiness that he hadn't had before, and Ringo as well, and John utterly in love with his wife Yoko. I mean, they were so in love. And I'm not saying the others weren't, but I mean, they were so visibly in love. And it was just, I think that finding their own paths was a very special thing. And still being able to make great music at the same time, obviously, is a huge bonus. But I've said this before, but when I was younger, like a lot of people, I thought that it was just a crying shame that the Beatles had broken up.
Yeah.
I felt, bereft, and I wish they would come back together. I used to wear a badge urging them to get back together again. But I'm actually looking at it from a more mature perspective. I think it's good that they realised when it had come to its end, that they realised when the thing had run its course in a way that, that they had done what they wanted to do, and now they wanted to do different things, and let's go our separate ways. That's actually a mature thing. And most people cling to success because they're afraid of it disappearing. And they had this phenomenal collective success, the Beatles, and yet they were prepared to throw it away. Yeah. And that is a bravery that very rarely gets remarked on. Yeah. Yeah. But it's extraordinary they broke up their own group voluntarily because it wasn't satisfying them anymore. Okay, there were other issues as well, business particularly, but nonetheless, that was the end result. They broke up the Beatles because it suited them to do so, and that's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is.
And what an end. It was a beautiful album.
Yes, and it ends on a track called The End, followed only by a film called Let It Be. I mean, everything was perfect with the Beatles. It was just like, if you wrote it as fiction, you wouldn't believe it, and it would seem too far-fetched, but it did all happen.
Do you think that it was a conscious decision, like George Martin says, to do one last great album, or was it not decided?
Well, George Martin has also said in a 1971 interview, which was quite close to the events, that he didn't think it would be their last album because at the point of making it, it seemed that they put their problems behind them. So I think they knew it was their last album, except, what am I saying? There's a meeting that they have just after Abbey Road is recorded, but before it's released. It's just about to be released, and they're going to have a 4-way meeting at Savile Row to discuss the Beatles from this point forward. Where do we go from here? What's our next move together? And Ringo can't be there because he's not well, so they stick a cassette recorder on the desk and record it so that he can hear the meeting he's missing. And that tape exists, and I've heard a little bit of it. And they're intending to do more work together after Abbey Road. So this business of they knew it was their last, I'm not even sure how true that is when it really comes down to it. Yeah. Because they're talking about doing a single for Christmas. Not a Christmas single, a single for Christmas. Mm-hmm. And they're talking about doing another album. So it's not necessarily true that they knew it was going to be their last. But what is clear is that the July sessions were a much more focused period of work in order to complete the record that was half finished, half done. And they got George Martin back in for that. And when he speaks of the phone call he had from Paul to say, come back and work with us again, he's talking about those July sessions.
Yeah.
So he's talking about a June phone call from Paul.
Yeah. And like produce it like he used to.
Which he didn't really, because they so knew what they wanted by this point. And if George wasn't there, it really didn't make any difference anymore. But obviously they liked it when he was there. He was there quite a bit in January for the Get Back sessions, so-called, as I keep saying. But it didn't matter whether he was in the room or not, because they completely knew what they wanted and how it could be got.
So why ask him?
Because he's nice to have around, because he does have good ideas, and because he is an enabler of their wishes.
Yeah. Like the orchestrations and things.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't want George Martin around? He's a very likeable man, brilliantly creative, and always constructive with his criticism as well as his praise. But they didn't need him in the room. That's the point. I mean, quite a bit of the White Album was done without him as well.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thanks very much for this long and very fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah.
Let me
Just a
just
Sunday morning chat.
let me just finish by one thing that we mentioned in the show that we did on you last summer, and because we can read and tune in about the many miracles that are part of the Beatles canon, and just meeting Brian Epstein, meeting George Martin, just all at the right place. And in that show, we all said, well, maybe the existence of someone like Mark Lewisohn is a miracle in itself, because I think there is no one like you in pop history, in rock history. There's only one Mark Lewisohn. I don't think Bob Dylan has a Mark Lewisohn. I don't think the Rolling Stones do have a Mark Lewisohn. There's only one Mark Lewisohn, and I just want to thank you very much for your work.
Actually, I do know of another Mark Lewisohn.
Okay.
I've been to lunch with him. But thank you very much.
Yeah.
The Beatles deserve someone. I'm glad it's me, and I think as I said earlier, I think my skill set is the skill set that's required. But all great figures of history should have a chronicler or a historian, and many do. But I don't know. There are many biographies of Dylan and many Dylanographers, if that's the right word, who are really into the subject and know it inside out. But it is the Beatles story must be told well and thoroughly, and be the product of enormous care, because it's so important. And if it isn't right, it will be wrong, and that would be a crime, for it to be wrong. It's just the most wonderful story ever.
Well, thanks very much, and I wish you all good health and good prosperity that you finish your trilogy. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fab4Cast.